The science, the ethics, and the controversy of UW Primate research is next on For the Record. Good morning, I'm Neil Heinen. I need a minute here to give you the context for today's program and today's guests. A couple of years back, Rick Marolt and Rick Bogle met with the WISC editorial board to discuss primate research and to ask the board to oppose such research at the University of Wisconsin. The board has yet to take a position and may or may not. It is, for example, irrevocably split on the death penalty. Some issues cannot achieve consensus. But in the meantime, last November, Madison Magazine, for which I am also editorial director, chose UW professor Dr. Richard Davidson, one of the world's most renowned and respected researchers on the brain, as Person of the Year. Rick Marolt contacted me to express his objection to that choice, and from the discussions that ensued, Madison Magazine hired writer Maggie Ginsberg-Schutz to research and report on the issue, which she did in the June issue of Madison Magazine, which will be on the newsstands for another couple of weeks yet. It's the longest story Madison Magazine has ever run. But Mr. Marolt is also interested in public conversation on the issue, and so producer Jeff Robbins and I asked Professor Davidson, Dr. Eric Sandgren, an associate professor of experimental pathology at the UW School of Veterinary Medicine, and Edgewood College and UW-Madison business instructor Rick Marolt, and Rick Bogle, the director of the Primate Freedom Project, to join us this morning. All agreed, and I welcome them to For the Record this morning. Thank you all, gentlemen.
Thank you, Neil.
Just as a point of context for our viewers, as briefly as you can, could you explain your particular position on this issue and the role that you play in this conversation? And I'll start with you, Dr. Davidson, just in terms of the amount of the role that animal research plays in your work.
I'm happy to do that. Animal research plays a very, very small role, infinitesimally small, in my own research. I do not have any grants for animal projects as a principal investigator, and I've never had any such grants in my entire career. I do collaborate with other scientists who do research at the animal level. And I have what I think is a nuanced position. On the one hand, I believe that there could be and should be improvements in the care that we employ for animals in our animal research, and I think that more can be done along these lines to make our treatment more humane. On the other hand, I am a strong defender of the importance of animal research to help prevent and cure some of the world's most devastating illnesses.
Thank you. Dr. Sandgren.
Thank you. Yes, I'm a professor at the university. My particular studies involve looking at the development of cancer in pancreas and liver at the genetic level, and in order to do that, I use mouse models of those diseases. My larger involvement in the issue of animal research is that I am director of the Animal Care and Use program on campus. So animal research is under very close oversight nationally, federally, and locally, and it's my responsibility to make sure that the animal care provided on campus is appropriate and acceptable.
Thank you. Mr. Marolt?
My interest in monkeys is about ethics. Thomas Paine said, a long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it the superficial appearance of being right. And there's been decades of research done on monkeys at UW-Madison. There's some people that has given it the superficial appearance of being right. I think it's very wrong. I teach ethics, I've studied ethics, and I can't find an ethical standard that research on monkeys meets. You can look at Aristotle, the Golden Rule, Kant, Kohlberg, Rawls, utilitarianism. It cannot meet an ethical standard. If that's too philosophical, I want to give you briefly two real-world examples of why I think the research is unethical. One of Great Britain's top investment firms no longer buys shares of animal labs to put into its ethical funds to make money for its customers, because its customers have told it that animal labs are unethical. And more recently, a court in Switzerland has ruled that scientists may not experiment on the brains of monkeys because Switzerland has a constitutional requirement that researchers consider the dignity of animals in their research, and this would violate their constitution. So what Richard Davidson does, he says infinitesimally small, but he has something like 30 monkeys in his research right now. And he does some very highly invasive work on monkeys' brains. If he did that in Switzerland, it would not only be unethical, it would be illegal. This issue is particularly important right now because UW-Madison wants to spend $160 million to double the capacity of its primate labs. And it wants Wisconsin taxpayers to pay up to $100 million of that amount. And it wants to do this at a time when the federal government is trying again to reduce the use of animals in labs. It's just come out with a new 5-year plan to reduce the use of animals in labs, but UW-Madison wants to double its use of primates.
Let me introduce Mr. Bogle, but please, I need any of you to question any facts here because I don't know what the facts are. So if anybody has any issue with any of the numbers here, I want you to say it, Mr. Bogle.
I'll just really quickly begin by saying that Dr. Sandgren's claim that the oversight is meaningful or very stringent is a little misleading. But let me get just to the point of why we're even here, I think, is at least Mr. Marolt and myself. It's wrong for the strong to exploit the weak for their benefit, for our own benefit. Doing that's what's led historically to every sort of atrocity that we can just sort of begin to name. Right now there's enough evidence on the table, I think, that's been accumulating for the past 100 years, looking at the cognitive and emotional similarities between non-human primates and humans that would make, I think, any reasonable person say, you know, we should really stop and consider this very carefully before we go any further. But that's not the position of the research community. They say that things should continue as usual and that we should maybe talk about this on the side. Rarely do you find the research community instigating any sort of discussion on this issue. It's always something that activists essentially have to almost force them into talking about the matter. The universities that are involved in the research, they're not putting on public presentations and asking critics to come in and debate the matter. It's something that they want the status quo to stay as it is, and the status quo was essentially developed thousands of years ago when we first started to try to delineate the human-animal relationship. It hasn't changed very much, and there's a massive amount of information right now, scientific evidence, that says that monkeys are much, and it makes sense. There's this evolutionary continuity that we know between all these different species, and certainly the animals that are the most similar to us, the closest to us in evolutionary time, should be the animals that are the closest to us in their minds. Even Dr. Davidson says this in the introduction to his papers. He says is that their emotional similarities, their cognitive similarities, seem to be the reasons that we should use them as models to use them to investigate the neurobiology of fear and anxiety.
Okay, let me get some response here. Do you want to begin with that? Or, I mean, because I have some questions about unraveling the ethics of this too.
Yeah, well, let me just say that the primary disease toward which our work is focused on addressing in terms of the animal models, and again, let me say that I myself have 0 monkeys. I do not maintain any monkey colony. I collaborate with other investigators who maintain these colonies. I lend my expertise on particular measures of brain activity, so I myself don't have any monkeys that I test. 99% of the work I do is in humans. I do think that the judicious use of non-human primates to address specific illness models is absolutely crucial. The disease that we are primarily focused on is depression. Depression is the worldwide leading cause of disability for individuals age 5 and over. There are almost 100 suicides per day in the United States every year, and those suicides are primarily committed by people with depression. And that's despite the extraordinary advances that have been made in treatment. And so it's very clear that the current understanding and the current treatments that we have for this devastating illness are thoroughly inadequate to address the magnitude of this problem. I believe that the judicious use of non-human primates for this research has the potential of saving enormous numbers of lives. And I think it is crucial for any investigator who does work with animals to ask her himself about whether the animals are necessary, to interrogate their motivation, to use as few animals as possible, to minimize the suffering of the animals, which I think can be done to a better degree than it is done now. So this is not a justification for the status quo, and I think that if my colleagues who are advocating for more humane treatment of animals were to be skillful in their means, I think that if they engaged in a more constructive dialogue with scientists, there is real possibility for improving the care of animals who are currently being used in research. So those are some of the issues which I think are germane.
Thank you. I want to talk about depression when we get back from the commercial break right after this.
Were you involved in some work?
We're back, and we are talking about primate research at the University of Wisconsin. An article on that topic is in this month's Madison magazine, and we are getting into some of the nuances there. There's a picture of the magazine that is currently on the stands. Rick Bogle, Dr. Davidson talked about depression specifically, and I would like just to hear if there's anything there that resonated with you.
Well, Dr. Davidson, like every other researcher that's using animals, is going to make the basic claim that their research, the disease or the condition that they're studying, is so important that it justifies their use of animals. You're not going to bring any researcher in and ask them, and they're not going to say anything different. Like, they're not going to say, well, it's not really that important. Every one of them is going to make the claim, what I'm doing is so important that therefore we have to use animals in the way that we're doing it.
Because they believe that.
Perhaps because they believe that. There's certainly a lot of money involved anyway. But let's say that they do believe that, just for the sake of argument. But they're all going to say that. So the question then is any illness, is all the research that they're doing, is it all justified because of the seriousness of the situation? The problem, of course, is that any situation can be considered so serious that if we devalue the animals to begin with, then we can use them for anything that we want to. It's been done in the past with humans. The argument for human experimentation has always been that the benefits are going to be so high that therefore we can justify doing anything we want to our experimental subjects. And the history of human experimentation is almost as extensive as the history of animal experimentation. We think that's wrong because we think that those individual research subjects have inalienable inherent rights. And it seems to me that given what we know about monkeys' minds, monkeys' emotions, that if we have inherent rights, unless we're going to say that these are simply God-given, and I don't hold that line of thought, then we're going to have to be consistent. We're going to have to say that monkeys have those inherent rights as well.
Okay. Eric Sandgren, I want to get back to the issue of ethics and how ethics is discussed in the area of primate research. Do researchers ever instigate? It's been said that researchers never instigate these conversations. How are ethics teased through in this research?
The consideration of ethics plays a fundamental role in evaluation of whether research should be conducted at many levels. I'd like to actually start with a comment that Rick Marolt made in the article, and that was that a big paradox of animal research is that the closer the animal is to the human species, the more similar it is. Therefore, the more information we can get that may be directly translatable to the human condition. That also then raises the ethical considerations. Where do we draw the line? When do we say something is not appropriate? And that's true. That is a fundamental paradox. And so we have to draw a line. And there are philosophical foundations that address how and when we can use animals in research. And we do follow those. I would disagree with the statement that was made before that it's not that scientists don't consider the ethics. You just heard Dr. Davidson talk very directly about that. Locally, and I think most forcefully, ethics are considered whenever we review a project that is proposed for use in animals. This is true whether it's non-human primates or mice or zebrafish. All of those animals are regulated, and in order for a study to go on, it has to demonstrate to generally a funding agency, but also to a committee on our campus, which consists of veterinarians, a scientist, and at least one or more unaffiliated members, has to demonstrate that it's addressing an important question, demonstrate that it is a question that can only be answered by using animals, that there are no alternatives for that. And then it also has to justify the way that the animals are treated in that study, explain exactly what will happen to that, and the committee has to approve that beforehand. It's also something that isn't static. This is something that changes over time. We do constantly try to improve the conditions of the animals. We do constantly refine the evaluation of specific techniques that are allowed in animals. So consideration of ethics is an inherent part of the review process, not just at the funding agencies, but also locally.
Just real quickly, the only study that's really looked at how accurate or how reliable the oversight committees are was Plouse and Herzog. Was published in Science not too long ago. What they said is that there's no reliability. If you take a protocol that was approved by one research committee and you give it to a second committee, that there's essentially no relation at all, that they never agree on the same things, no matter whether the study was going to entail a great deal of pain, electric shock, food and water deprivation, death, anything at all, that there was no correlation between what a committee at your research institution would decide on that particular research and what one at another looking at the same study. So the idea that there's this great amount of oversight, I think it's misleading. And certainly the research that has been done looking at those committees, the IACUCs are considered the keystone of the entire animal welfare program in the United States. And the limited amount of research that's looked at the reliability of those committees has said that essentially they're not consistent at all with each other. But that's beside the point. I think the question that we're more interested in is how similar to us does another species have to be? We've already begun to ban research on apes around the world. Some countries have already banned research on chimpanzees. Austria has banned research on all apes, and that includes all the way down to gibbons. And so how similar to us do they have to be? What are the characteristics that an animal has to have before you think it would just be wrong to hurt it? I would never hurt you, no matter what the benefits for me would be. But you're saying that the benefits can be so good for you that it's okay to hurt an animal. So there must be some clear qualitative characteristic that I have that they don't have. And I just don't understand what that is.
In other words,
if I can just respond to that. First of all, let me clarify the issue of hurt. In the work that I've collaborated on in non-human primates, I think the word hurt is very misleading. The protocols that we use do not involve pain to the animal. In fact, the research that we do in humans, I would say, we are permitted to inflict more pain if the protocol requires it than we can in non-human primates. And so I think it's deeply misleading to use the term hurt. I think that for the very reason that you're describing, because of some similarities in particular brain structures, in specific the circuits that are important in regulating emotion, there is, I think, a lot of reason to believe that the information that we can glean from non-human primates will be extremely important to us and much more important than research at the rodent level for certain key questions. And I think that this work can be done on a limited number of animals. I think that we need to continuously ask ourselves whether the procedures that we're using are absolutely necessary. The number of animals is necessary, and I think that there is a lot that we can do to keep it to a minimum. But I think given the magnitude of the human suffering that we are attempting to address, I think that it is, in fact, irresponsible not to engage in research where there is a clear promise of a new direction that may be pursued to minimize suffering and to minimize mortality and morbidity on a massive scale.
Let me pose a question.
Rick, let me get the last break in, and we will get your response right after this. Otherwise, you're going to have no time. Very quickly, I'm back with Professor Richard Davidson from the University of Wisconsin, a professor of brain research for the purposes of this argument. Dr. Eric Sandgren, who is with the School of Veterinary Medicine. Rick Marolt, who is a business professor at Edgewood and UW-Madison and is deeply involved in opposing primate research. And Rick Bogle, who is the head of the Primate Freedom Project. In response to the last segment, quickly.
Well, I'd like to pose a question to Richie Davidson, perhaps Eric also. I'm looking for an ethical standard here. And I've gone through, like I said, I've studied ethics, and I've gone through many different ethical frameworks, and I've tried to apply them to this problem of research on monkeys. I cannot find an ethical standard that supports your position. And the arguments you're making play up the benefits, the potential benefits. And I've heard you both speak in other forums about the nature of basic research, basic science. There may be benefits a long time from now from the basic science that we're doing now. I've heard Eric speak about utilitarianism and the benefits outweigh the costs. I'm looking for evidence of this. I'm looking for the standard that you use. Just to invoke possible benefits doesn't meet an ethical standard. Well, if it did meet an ethical standard, we would do the same work on people. But we don't meet the same work on people. Why not? What's the difference?
You asked for a concrete example. Let me give you a concrete.
No, I asked for a standard.
Well, you asked for a particular example of the benefits that might accrue, and a very concrete example is that there is now a trial going on with implanted electrodes in human patients with major depression who have been treatment resistant. It's directly based on research that's been done on the non-human primate level, and there are 2 published papers on this already, which show the potentially extraordinary benefit of stimulation in certain brain sites in human patients who have been treatment refractory in the past. And this represents a potentially revolutionary breakthrough that is very much based on the kind of research that we've been doing at the non-human primate level. Although, as I said, this is a preciously small part of what I do, but that kind of work has directly led to this new treatment, which is just being investigated.
But then don't we have to justify every experiment that's been done on a human that led to some sort of larger benefit for mankind? Isn't then J. Marion Sims' experiments on slave women during the Civil War, since that led to all sorts of advancements in gynecology, shouldn't we say that that was justified by experimenting on these slave women that we had to hold down? I don't understand.
Well, I think that we need to, in every case, we need to ask ourselves whether whatever suffering we're inflicting on a human or a non-human is justifiable in light of what it is that we're trying to do. I think that this in no way is a blanket justification for inflicting suffering on either humans or non-humans. In my view, there's far too much of that, and I think that scientists need to reflect on this more deeply. There is not enough of that in my own view. I think that we can be doing a much more creative and constructive, playing a much more creative and constructive effort in improving the care of both humans as well as animal experimental subjects. I think that there is an enormous amount of improvement that could be done, and I think that if we adopted a framework where scientists went through some regular process of reflecting on the specific needs and their intentions and their motivation for doing what they're doing, I think that a lot can be changed.
Dr. Sandgren says this is what's going on right now, and that's where we're at.
I think it is going
situation.
on, but I think that there's certainly room for improvement.
And I would add to that that's precisely what we are doing. We're improving. We're improving. Standards are changing. They've changed tremendously. Right now, there still are humans enrolled in scientific studies, and in fact, that is the solution for many animal activists. Study humans. Right now, every year, there are about twice as many humans enrolled in clinical trials, for instance, chemotherapeutic trials, than there are non-human primates used in research.
So
it's a combination here. We use humans, we use animals, we combine that information. That's how we learn.
We have 30 seconds left, Rick. What's the central issue?
Central issue is that we're using animals who are very similar to humans in a way that we would never use humans for. And I haven't heard an ethical defense of that.
And
The ethical defense basically is utilitarianism. It is a cost-benefit analysis. We look at the benefits, and that changes over time.
Why do you apply a different standard? You apply a different standard to monkeys than you apply to humans. Why do you apply different standards?
Okay. Thank you for giving this as much effort as you did. There was no way we're going to get through all the issues that we could in a half an hour, but I appreciate your taking the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll wrap this up in a minute. It's somewhat extraordinary that these four gentlemen agreed to appear together on this show, and I am appreciative that they agreed to do so. I direct your attention again to the current issue of Madison Magazine, where you will find a lengthy interview and report on this issue by writer Maggie Ginsberg-Schutz. And I thank you for joining me this week on For the Record. We'll see you next Sunday. Enjoy the rest of your day.